Hello there, dear traveller. I'm so glad you've found your way to this quiet corner of history, where the only sound is the faint crackling of the fire and the whisper of wind outside your window. Whether you've come here to gently drift off to sleep, to quiet your thoughts after a long day, or to simply lie still and let your mind wander through the past, I welcome you warmly. You've chosen a fine time to listen, because tonight, we're venturing back into a season that chilled more than just bones. We're returning to the brutal, unforgiving winters of medieval Europe. Before we begin, I'd love to know, just between us, where you're listening from tonight. Maybe you're tucked into bed, warm beneath your covers. Maybe the sky outside your window is still dark. Maybe it's morning, and you're trying to ease your way gently into the day. Wherever you are, and whatever brought you here, I hope this quiet story keeps you company. Now, take a slow, deep breath and imagine. The world has no electricity, no central heating, no running water, no glass on the windows. The wind creeps in through the cracks in your walls. Your hands are raw from the cold. Your breath rises in soft clouds, even when you're inside. It's the middle of January. The sun rises late and sets far too early. You haven't seen anything green in weeks. The ground outside is frozen, and the earth feels as hard as iron. Your stores are low. You ration what's left of last year's harvest. You stretch one stale loaf of bread across 3 days. Your turnips are shriveled. The salted pork smells off, but you eat it anyway. You aren't alone in your suffering. In every cottage across the village, the same bleak struggle plays out. Children curl against their mothers for warmth. The elderly don't speak much. They sit close to the hearth, eyes half closed, trying to preserve what little strength they have left. Even the animals are quieter. The cow's breath steams in the barn, but her ribs are showing. The hens haven't laid in days. There's a stillness that settles over everything during the worst of winter. Not a peaceful stillness, more like a wait. The world seems to pause. But it's not restful. It's waiting, watching, testing who will make it to spring. You see, in the Middle Ages, winter wasn't just a season. It was a threat, a rival, and not everyone survived it. Modern winters, for many of us, mean coats and candles, mugs of tea and quiet evenings indoors. But for medieval people, the season meant sickness, starvation, isolation, and death. It loomed over them year after year, a slow and silent predator. Some winters were harsher than others. There were years when the river froze so solid you could walk across it. Years when the snow didn't melt until April. Years when the stored grain rotted from damp or was stolen by rats. Years when entire communities dwindled and disappeared before the thaw. But somehow they carried on. They endured. And tonight, we're going to explore how. We'll wander through those drafty halls and smoky huts. We'll peer into their soup pots, their tattered beds, and their frostbitten fields. We'll meet the people who braved each long, dark night and woke each morning with the will to keep going. This isn't a story of grand kings or famous battles. This is a story about ordinary people, about their quiet bravery, their resilience, their shared firewood and borrowed coats, their whispered prayers and hollow-bellied hopes. And yes, there will be sorrow, but there will also be tenderness. A neighbour sharing her last onion, a child giggling by the hearth, a hopeful face turned toward the first warm breeze of spring. So now, dear listener, I invite you to let go of the day behind you. Let your shoulders drop, let your breathing slow, let the worries in your mind begin to blur and fade. The fire is lit. The blankets are pulled close. The past is calling, but gently, like a lullaby carried on snow. Let us walk together into the cold. Let us learn how they survived. Let us begin. Let's start by stepping inside. Just for a moment. It's easy to imagine a house as a refuge from winter, a place where the door closes and the world stays out. But in the medieval world, home was never a perfect barrier. In fact, It often let winter come right in. Picture it now, a small, squat building, probably no bigger than your bedroom. The walls are made of wattle and daub, sticks packed with mud and straw. It sounds sturdy enough, but cracks appear easily. Rain leaks in, cold seeps through. The roof? Thatched with straw or reeds, browned by years of wind and soot. There's no insulation, no ceiling, just beams overhead, where spiders nest and smoke gathers. Sometimes, in the dead of winter, snow works its way under the eaves and drops down into the room in quiet clumps. There's no chimney, just a hole in the roof to let out the smoke. But that hole doesn't just let the smoke escape, it also invites in rain, sleet, wind, and curious birds. And on stormy nights, the fire goes out. You wake coughing, chilled to your bones, blinking through the acrid haze. Let's move closer to the walls. They're damp to the touch, always. The air carries the smell of mold, smoke, and wet wool. In the corners, rats rustle. And in the winter, even rats seek warmth. There are no windows, at least, not the kind you and I would recognize. If there is an opening, it's covered with oiled parchment or thin cloth, not glass. It lets in a faint grey light during the day, and little else. At night, it's patched with boards, but still, the wind whistles through. Now look down at your feet. The floor is earth-packed dirt, uneven and cold. In some homes, they scatter straw, or rushes to soak up spills and waste, but after a few weeks, that straw becomes filthy, damp, and alive with bugs. You try to sleep near the fire, curled on a sack of straw, but it's always a little damp, always a little cold, always a little too real. And yet, this was home. For peasants, these single-room dwellings were everything. Work, sleep, meals, births, deaths all, happened right here, within arm's reach of the hearth. Chickens roosted in corners. A goat might wander in. The children piled on top of one another for warmth. Privacy didn't exist, nor did silence. When the wind howled outside, it found every crack. When the frost crept in, it kissed the toes of sleeping children and didn't let go. Water left overnight turned to ice. Bread left too close to the wall grew soft with damp. Even your clothing never truly dried, it just got a little less wet. And for those slightly better off, the houses of wealthier townsfolk or minor nobles may have stone walls and wooden floors, but they weren't cozy either. The stone chilled faster than earth. And unless you lived in a castle, those walls weren't thick enough to stop winter's fingers from creeping in. In fact, castles had their own miseries. Massive stone halls that echoed with cold. Huge fireplaces that warmed only those standing right in front of them. Servants slept in bare rooms or corridors, tucked into corners with whatever rags they could find. Even royalty complained of drafts. To cope, people layered everything. Blankets, cloaks, straw mats, old animal hides. They hung tapestries on the wall snot for decoration, but to stop the wind. They slept in bundles, multiple generations under the same woolen heap. They prayed the fire wouldn't die in the night. Some built small sleeping boxes enclosed beds, with doors or curtains to trap body heat. In the wealthiest homes, there might be feather beds, furs, or warm bricks placed under covers. But for most, comfort was measured in degrees of suffering. Imagine waking every morning with stiff fingers, lips tinged blue, and joints that ache long before old age. Imagine lying in the dark, listening to the wind press against your house, like a beast trying to get in, and knowing it already has. And yet, there was something else too. Something small, but strong. The habit of gathering. No matter how cold the room or thin the walls, people gathered close, around the fire, around the table, around each other. They shared body heat, shared stories, shared the silence. The walls might not keep out the winter, but sometimes What was inside those walls, love? Stubbornness, sheer will was enough to push the cold back just a little. So tonight, as you lie warm beneath your own roof, consider what it meant to survive in a house that couldn't keep out the cold, where every winter was a test of endurance. And every morning frost on the inside of your walls was just another reminder that you were still here, still breathing, still fighting, still hoping for spring. Let's turn our attention to the hearth, that little pocket of flame flickering at the heart of every medieval home. It was more than just a fire. It was the center of life, the only real source of heat, light, and cooking. Everything revolved around it, and yet it was never enough. In your mind's eye, imagine a family gathered close around a low, open fire. The smoke curls upward, not into a chimney, but toward a rough hole in the roof. There is no flue, no ventilation, no way to keep the wind out while letting the smoke escape. So most of the smoke doesn't escape at all. It hovers, it chokes, it burns the eyes, settles in the lungs, blackens the beams overhead. Children cough, grandmothers wheeze, pots bubble over with stew, but the air is thick and foul. Everything smells faintly of soot. You can feel it coating the back of your throat. And this is normal. You see, the fire was a fickle thing. When the wood was dry, it gave a clean, quick burn. But in winter, dry wood was a luxury. Most of what was gathered from the forest or scavenged from fallen trees was damp, or old, or rotten, and wet wood doesn't burn cleanly, it smoulders. Sometimes people burned peat or dung, pressed into cakes. The smoke from that? Worse still, but it was fuel. And when you're choosing between stinking smoke or no fire at all, you choose the smoke. The fire did what it could. It kept one side of you warm while your back stayed cold. It boiled pottage, baked coarse bread, dried your sodden boots, but the heat never reached far. Just a few feet away, the temperature dropped sharply. Just a few hours after the fire died down, the entire room returned to freezing. Still, people clung to that fire like a lifeline. The hearth was the center of the home, literally and emotionally. It was where meals were made, tools were repaired, clothes were dried, stories were told. It was the last light before sleep, and the first flicker you hoped for in the dark of morning. Tending the fire was a sacred task, especially for women and children. A fire that went out overnight meant a dangerous, shivering morning. You'd need to spark a new one with flint and tinder, coaxing it to life with frozen fingers. In some villages, neighbors would lend fire-sharing coals with those who had none. A small kindness, but sometimes life-saving. In wealthier homes, great hearths were built into the stone walls, impressive, cavernous fireplaces with logs the size of a man's leg. But even there, warmth didn't reach the corners. Servants huddled in cloaks. Guests pulled their benches as close to the flames as etiquette allowed. The moment you stepped away from the hearth, the cold closed in again, fast and unforgiving. And let's not forget the danger. Fire might warm your hands, but it could also destroy your home. Thatched roofs caught quickly. Wooden beams were dry as tinder. A single overturned oil lamp or careless spark could burn down a cottage in minutes. So the hearth had to be watched carefully, banked at night, fed just enough, guarded like treasure. Even in monasteries, where rules dictated the rhythm of daily life, fires were both blessing and burden. Monks would take turns tending the heat. Cold fingers turned the pages of books. Smoke rolled through the scriptorium. No one complained. Not really. It was part of life. And yet, despite all its shortcomings, the fire remained a kind of miracle. A soft, living thing in a world of frost. The dance of orange light against the walls was often the only color in an otherwise grey winter. And in the hush of night, the faint crackle of embers was a comfort. In many households, It was tradition to sit by the fire in the evening not just to warm up, but to speak, share gossip, tell folk tales, remember the dead. For those few hours, the fire drew people together in the closest thing to warmth they had. So, tonight, as you perhaps listen near a quiet light of your own, maybe an electric lamp or a digital screen spare, a thought for those huddled in the smoky dark centuries ago. The ones who watched the flame not with curiosity, but with reverence. Because for them, a fire was not a cozy touch, it was survival. And they knew, better than anyone, just how easily the cold could slip back in. Let's talk about food, or rather, the lack of it. In the medieval winter, hunger was not an inconvenience. It was a familiar, gnawing presence, always there, a quiet ache in the belly, a thinness in the face, a silence at mealtime when there should have been chewing, slurping, laughter. Because when the crops stopped growing and the ground turned to stone, what you had left was what you'd stored, and for most people, that wasn't very much. Imagine now a larderif, you could call it that, a cool, dark corner of a peasant's home. Inside are the remains of the summer's labour, a few sacks of dried beans, maybe a clay jar of oats, salted pork, yellowed with fat and tucked into a crusted wooden barrel. If you were lucky, a few turnips. If you were very lucky, they weren't already soft. There is no refrigeration, no supermarkets. Nothing new is coming until the next thaw. So every meal is a calculation, every mouthful a choice. Do you eat now and risk running short later? Or do you stretch it, eat less, and feel the slow pull of exhaustion growing with each passing day? The staple food for most people during winter was potagia, kind of thick stew. Think of it like a never-ending soup. You'd keep a pot over the fire, constantly topped up with whatever you had. Dried peas, lentils, bitter cabbage, some leftover broth. If meat was added, it was usually scraps. A knuckle bone, a fatty rind, maybe a sliver of rabbit, if one had been snared. The pottage boiled day and night, getting thicker and stranger as the weeks wore on. Sometimes sour, sometimes watery, sometimes accidentally delicious, but mostly just food. Something to fill the belly and stave off the cold. Bread too was a staple, but not the kind you'd want. Heavy, dense loaves made from rye or barley, coarse and dry. If the harvest had been bad, flour might be mixed with ground peas, acorns, or even sawdust. Yes, sawdust. It made the flour stretch further, even if it did nothing for the taste. Ale was common not because it made meals festive, but because water was often unsafe to drink. Weak, sour, and often cloudy, ale was the drink of survival. It gave a little energy, helped wash down dry bread, and was safer than the well. Salted fish might appear in wealthier homes-preserved cod or herring from coastal trade routes, but to most villagers, fish was a dream, as were spices, as was honey, as were apples. Fresh fruit and vegetables in winter? Almost unheard of. Anything perishable was gone by late autumn unless carefully stored in a root cellar, and even then, rot found its way in. So what did people do? They foraged when they could. Even in snow, they'd search for wild garlic, mushrooms, nettles, bitter but edible. Children were sometimes sent out to find what grown-ups had overlooked. A handful of rose hips could feel like treasure. A cluster of frostbitten berries magic. They traded. A few eggs for a loaf, a patch of wool for a handful of dried herbs. They bartered, borrowed, begged. Sometimes they stole, and sometimes they just went without. By February, many peasants had reached what was known as the lean season. Stores nearly gone, fields still frozen, hunger at its deepest. This was the time when people began eating things that were never meant to be eaten. Boiled bark, thatch from the roof, shoes, the leather softened in water and chewed into submission. It wasn't madness, it was necessity. And in towns? Things weren't much better. Though markets operated year-round, prices soared in winter. A peasant's wages might buy a few onions, no more. And if snow blocked the roads, even those disappeared. Of course, the nobility lived differently. In their halls, cooks roasted meats on spits, boiled pears in wine, baked pies filled with dried fruits and nuts. But even their luxury had limits. Food spoiled quickly, storage was unreliable, and winter travel was dangerous. A noble might feast one day and be eating old cheese and barley the next. Still, there's one thing that cuts across class lines in winter: craving. Not just hunger, but the craving for variety, for flavor, for something different. A pickle, a dried plum, a spoonful of honey. These were delights that lit up the tongue like sunlight through a shutter. So when a neighbor shared an onion, or a monk passed around a loaf, or a child brought home a frozen apple, they weren't just sharing food, they were offering relief, joy, hope. Tonight, as you think of meals past and meals to come, spare a thought for those who lived not from recipe to recipe, but from bowl to bowl. For those who stirred the same pot, day after day, and hoped quietly that it would last one more. Because, in the medieval winter, the question was rarely, "What's for dinner?" It was, "Is there any dinner at all?" Winter hunger wasn't a surprise. It was expected, almost like a season of its own. Not every year brought famine, but every year brought the fear of it. The deeper the cold, the deeper the worry. You could feel it settle over the village like a second frost. People counted what little they had, not in meals, but in days, in handfuls, in how thin the porridge could stretch and still be called food. The Great Hunger wasn't always one grand event. It was the steady, predictable slowdown of life when food trickled away faster than it came in. It began quietly, a skipped second helping. A smaller loaf baked this week than last. Then came the harder choices. Do you save the last pork fat for the baby, or melt it into soup for everyone? But some winters brought more than hunger. They brought catastrophe. In the year 1315, rain fell for months. The crops drowned. Grain rotted in the fields. Hay was too wet to store. Livestock starved because there was no fodder. And what came next was famine. Not just in one village, not just for the poor. It spread across Europe like a slow, cold fire burning through towns and fields and families alike. People ate bark and roots. They boiled belts and shoes. They tore thatch from their own roofs and softened it in stew. Horses disappeared. Cats and dogs vanished from the streets. Some whispered about worse things done in desperation, in darkness. And yet, this was not a fluke. It was simply a worse version of what they already knew. Hunger didn't need disaster to arrive. It just needed time. Spring might bring relief, but only if the seeds could be planted. Only if the ground thawed. Only if there was still enough strength left in your limbs to dig and sow. Some didn't make it to that point. They slipped away in February, or March, just a few weeks short of the first green shoots. And still, they planned. Still, they hoped. Peasants would set aside a pouch of seed, even if it meant less food now. To eat that seed was unthinkable. It meant no harvest, no future. So they guarded it with their lives. Hunger didn't just affect the body, it slowed the mind, made people forget things. Children cried less not because they weren't hungry, but because they were too tired to cry. Mothers aged overnight. Fathers stared into fires and spoke less and less. Whole villages fell into silence. Not the silence of peace, but the quiet of exhaustion. And still, life went on. Somehow, people leaned on each other. Villages shared what they could. A turnip traded for a candle. A bag of oats divided between 3 families. Monasteries opened their doors to the starving at least, when they had anything left to give. Some lords were kind, others weren't. Some gave grain from their stores, others raised rents even during famine. Sometimes there was rage, a stolen sack of flour, a hoarded pile of cheese discovered. Bread riots weren't modern inventions. They happened then too. When desperation met injustice, people pushed back even when they had no strength left to push. But mostly, the Great Hunger was endured in silence. And that silence echoed through the years. You'd hear it in the way people spoke about winter, in the prayers they whispered as snow began to fall, in the caution of every family who stored more than they needed, just in case. Even generations later, long after that particular famine had passed, the fear remained. It lived in the walls, in the rhythm of the seasons, in the way people watched the sky for signs. A bad frost could still mean a bad harvest. A bad harvest could still mean an empty spring. And so, year after year, the hunger returned, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in screams. Tonight, as you lie full and warm, let that settle gently in your mind, not as guilt, but as perspective, a reminder of how fragile plenty can be, and how, once upon a time, entire villages measured the length of a winter not by the number of days, but by how many people made it through. They didn't always know when the Great Hunger would come, but they always knew it would return. Let's return to the night. Not the kind of night filled with soft sheets, central heating, or a fan humming gently from the corner. Let's step into a medieval nighter, real winter night. The kind that stings the nose, numbs the toes, and doesn't let go until morning. When the sun dipped below the horizon, temperatures dropped fast. Inside the home, the fire dimmed to coals. Blankets were pulled tight. People gathered close, but even together, the chill crept in. So, they brought in help of the four-legged kind. In peasant homes, livestock were more than just animals. They were warmth, they were income, they were survival, and during the long, bitter winters, they were roommates. A goat might sleep in the corner, her sides rising and falling softly with each breath. A pig might huff and grunt under the bench. Chickens found their perch near the rafters, fluffing up their feathers against the cold. Sometimes, a calf or lamb biff born in winter was swaddled in straw and kept close to the hearth. It was noisy, it was messy, it was smelly, but it was warm. Animals gave off body heat. A lot of it. And in a one-room cottage with no insulation and a fire that didn't last the night, every extra degree made a difference. The warmth of a cow could be felt across the room. The closeness of a pig was sometimes the only thing standing between a child and hypothermia. And people didn't just sleep near animals, they slept on top of them, beside them, against them. Children might curl up next to a shaggy dog or tuck their feet under a goat's belly. The lines between bed and barn blurred. Cleanliness wasn't the goal, warmth was. In wealthier homes, animals were kept in outbuildings, stables, barns, or byres, but even then, their well-being was vital. A frozen cow meant no milk. A sick horse meant no travel. So servants were often tasked with sleeping in the barns themselves, keeping the animals company and watching for signs of illness or birth. In return, they too stayed a little warmer than they might have indoors. Of course, this closeness came at a cost. Fleas and lice were common. Dung piled up quickly. Respiratory issues from breathing in ammonia and animal dander were just accepted as part of life. But for many, it was worth it. When you've felt the kind of cold that stiffens your fingers before you've taken 5 steps, a little stink is a small price to pay. In some monasteries and manors, people tried cleverer solutions. Stones were heated by the fire and placed in beds to warm the blankets. Bricks wrapped in cloth, iron pots filled with embers. Some even built sleeping box enclosed beds that trapped body heat with wood and curtains. But for the average villager, the solution was simpler. Pile together and sleep like animals because you were sleeping with them. And that closeness, though, born of necessity, bred something else too. Connection. Children learn to sleep to the rhythm of a pig's breath, to the occasional twitch of a hen. They knew the warmth of fur and the comfort of soft, bristled coats. And they knew, deeply and instinctively, that survival wasn't something you did alone. It was something you did in community even, if that community clucked or mooed. There's something quietly beautiful about that, don't you think? Tonight, as you drift off in your own warm bed, remember the families who did the same centuries ago, curled up, together with animals, bodies packed close, hearts beating through the cold. Their homes weren't comfortable, but they were alive. And in the medieval winter, that counted for everything. Let us now speak of sickness. Because where winter went, illness followed close behind, creeping in through cracks in the walls, clinging to breath, settling deep into lungs that never quite dried out. And, in the Middle Ages, there were few things more frightening than falling ill during the coldest months of the year. The symptoms started small: a cough, a chill that wouldn't leave, a tightness in the chest, a little boy with a red nose who stopped running, an old woman who stopped eating. And then, suddenly, it was serious. Without modern antibiotics, even the most ordinary illnesses could turn deadly. A cold might become bronchitis, a sore throat might swell shut, a fever might climb and never fall. Influenza, pneumonia, dysentery, and consumption, what we now call tuberculosis, were constant threats, made worse by the cold, the damp, and the poor nutrition of winter diets. But even worse than the diseases was the fact that no one really knew what caused them. Doctors, if you had access to one, might arrive wearing thick cloaks and serious faces. But they came armed not with cures, but with theories. The medieval world still operated under the ancient belief of humours, four fluids, inside the body: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness was thought to arise when these humours fell out of balance. A cough? Too much phlegm. A fever? Too much blood. The solution? Rebalance. That's how bloodletting became a common treatment. Sick people were bled with knives or leeches, sometimes until they fainted. If that didn't work, they might be forced to vomit, purge, or sweat it out by lying next to scalding hot stones. You were already weak, starving, and freezing, and now you were losing blood too. It wasn't just bad medicine, it was dangerous. But it was all they had. Herbs were used as well. Some, like thyme or garlic, may have helped. Others, like mercury or powdered toad, almost certainly didn't. Apothecaries sold dried roots, crushed beetles, and charmed amulets. Housewives made poultices and teas from whatever grew last summer and hadn't yet gone mouldy. Still, when remedies failed, and they often did, people turn to prayer. Church bells tolled for the sick. Monks lit candles in freezing chapels. Family members whispered invocations to saints who specialized in healing: Saint Sebastian for plague, Saint Roch for fevers, Saint Apollonia for toothaches. Relics were kissed, holy water sprinkled, bones touched. And when none of that worked, they looked for reasons. Was it a punishment from God? A curse from a neighbor? A bad omen from a bird overhead? Medieval minds, lacking science, sought order in chaos. Superstition filled the gaps where understanding faltered. A red sky, a comet, a dying cow-wall were suspect. Sometimes the sick were blamed. If someone fell ill after a disagreement, rumors might spread. A witch, they whispered. Someone had cursed the bread. And in the dark of winter, fear was easily fed. A woman who brewed herbs might be shunned. A child with a strange birthmark might be kept indoors. But in the monasteries, something quieter was happening. Monks and nuns ran hospitals, not the kind we think of, with white coats and machines, but stone rooms with straw mattresses and broth pots on the fire. The sick were brought in, cleaned, fed, and prayed over. There were no cures, but there was care. Gentle hands, warm blankets, and silence. Some lived, many didn't, and through it all, the cold remained. A fever burned hot in the chest, but the toes stayed blue. You might sweat under every blanket you owned, only to freeze the next moment. You'd drift in and out of sleep, chasing warmth in dreams that never quite arrived. For the poor, there was no doctor, only neighbours, family, and God. A mother sat by her coughing child, holding a damp cloth to a hot forehead. A farmer coughed blood into the snow and said nothing. A widow lit a candle and whispered the same prayer she'd whispered the winter before and the winter before that. And yet, among the confusion, the fear, and the failure, there was also resilience. People survived, not all but enough. They learned which herbs helped, even if they didn't know why. They washed wounds with wine. They bundled the sick in straw and sang lullabies when medicine ran out. They waited for spring, even as they buried those who wouldn't see it. So tonight, if you feel the warmth of your blanket and the safety of knowing help is just a call away, remember those who once fought winter's illnesses with only smoke, soup, and hope. Because sometimes hope was all they had. We've spoken of cold floors and thin meals, of smoke-filled hearths and sleeping beside animals. But there was another kind of cold in the medieval winterone you couldn't see and couldn't quite shake. A cold that settled deeper than the skin. The kind that crept into the spirit. You might call it sorrow, weariness, emptiness. But whatever name it wore, this winter heaviness was real. It was there in the long hours of darkness, when the sky turned grey before the day's work was even done. It was there in the silence of snow-covered roads, when no visitors came and no news arrived. It was there in the stillness of frozen fields, when nothing grew, nothing changed, and nothing promised to come. For those living in the Middle Ages, this wasn't a poetic melancholy. It was the rhythm of survival, the slowing of everything, movement, conversation, thought. You rose in the dark, worked in the cold, ate without joy, slept without rest, and began again. There were no words for depression then, at least not the way we know it now. But people knew the feeling. They described it as a heaviness of the soul, a darkness that wouldn't lift, a fog in the mind. Priests might call it sloth or melancholia. Philosophers spoke of humours turned sour, but those who felt it just called it what it was, winter. Think of the young mother, her hands cracked from hauling water, nursing a sick child in a room without heat. She hasn't left the house in weeks. Her neighbours are quiet. Her bread has gone stale. The child might live, or not. And outside, the wind never stops. Or the old man who once farmed his land with pride, now stiff with age, watching frost coat the bare trees. His sons are gone. His back no longer bends. His fire is low, and his joints ache worse with every snowfall. Or the boy, barely 8, who hasn't seen sunlight in days. He sits on a stool, watching the coals. No games, no laughter, no lessons, just cold feet and a growling stomach. And he wonders quietly, privately, if winter has always lasted this long. Even in castles, where the fires blazed hotter and the tables were fuller, the mood could grow dark. Courtiers grew restless. Nobles quarrelled more. Messengers were delayed by snow. And with less entertainment and travel, rumours spread faster than joy. Some found comfort in routine daily prayers, chores, the repetition of small tasks. Others turned inward, writing, carving, sewing. A few found escape in alcohol, or worse. Winter brought stillness, but not always peace. And yet, there were small things that helped. Songs sung by the fire, a shared story, a letter delivered after weeks of waiting, the simple act of lighting a candle at dusk. Even a knock at the door brought relief, a neighbor's face reminding you that you weren't alone in the gloom. In monasteries, the silence of winter was almost welcome. The rhythm of prayer and ritual offered structure. The cold stone walls felt less lonely when everyone inside them had chosen solitude. Still, even monks were not immune. In some records, you'll find notes of despair brothers who stopped speaking, who wept in the cloisters, who needed gentler hands and kinder words to see them through the dark months. And so, they leaned on each other, just as peasants leaned on family, as travelers huddled together in roadside inns, as widows sat beside daughters, mending clothes by candlelight. Because the frost in the soul-like, the frost on the fields was never something one could face alone. Tonight, in your own quiet room, you may know something of that stillness, that winter hush, but you have light at your fingertips, warmth at your call, and, hopefully, the knowledge that it will pass. But for medieval people, the passing wasn't guaranteed. The winter might ease by March or deepen until May. They had no forecasts, no assurance, just memory, just stories, just each other. So when the wind howled, and the days shortened, and the nights pressed heavy on the heart, they whispered prayers, they sang softly, they waited, and above all they endured. Because even if the soul grew cold, they believed somehow that warmth would return. Let's take a breath now and turn our gaze towards something brighter. Because even in the bitter heart of winter, even when the wind froze the trees and the fields lay silent beneath snow, medieval people found ways to laugh, to sing, to mock the cold, if only for a day. One of the strangest and most delightful of these moments came in the form of Misrule. The festival of Misrule was a strange holiday, a deliberate inversion of the world. Held during Christmastide, often around Twelfth Night, it was a sanctioned break from order, from routine, from the weight of winter itself. In villages and towns, people gathered to crown a lord of Misrule, often a young man, a servant, or a peasant chosen at random. He would be dressed in ribbons or rags, draped in old curtains or strange hats, and for one day he ruled the village. Rules were reversed, servants gave orders, children poked fun at elders, songs turned bawdy, dances grew rowdy, pranks were played, and ale flowed freely. The streets rang with laughter, not elegant courtly mirth, but belly laughs, shrieks, and wheezes that warmed cold lungs and hearts. In noble courts, this tradition grew elaborate. Courtiers dressed in absurd costumes. Parodies were performed. Feasts were served backwards, dessert first, soup last. The lord might order knights to scrub floors, or priests to dance jigs. No one was safe, and that was the point. It wasn't rebellion, it was release. Because in a world of rigid roles, limited joy, and endless cold, Misrule gave people a brief chance to turn things upside down. And in that turning, something was released. Tension, frustration, sadness. For the poor, it was also one of the only times they might eat well. The wealthy were expected to share, to open their gates, to feed the village with roasted meat, mulled wine, pies stuffed with dried fruits. On those nights, full bellies mingled with full hearts, and for a moment, the bite of winter dulled. But it was only a moment, because the festival of Misrule was never meant to last. The next morning, the masks came off. The servant returned to scrubbing floors. The child went back to quiet obedience. The village, still echoing with laughter, returned to the silence of cold routine. And in some ways, that made it harder. False warmth, false power, false joy. It all vanished with the frost on the windows. But still they celebrated, year after year, even knowing the laughter would end, even knowing the next day would be hungrier, darker, colder than before. Because sometimes, in the heart of suffering, a brief moment of absurdity is enough to carry you through. In churches too, there were winter celebrations, Candlemas, Epiphany, feasts of the saints, songs echoed in stone halls, incense filled the air. And even if the prayers didn't bring food or firewood, they brought comfort, the promise of light, of renewal, of grace. People sang louder during winter, perhaps out of defiance, or desperation, or both. And it wasn't just festivals. Little pockets of Misrule cropped up everywhere. A child pretending to be a king, a widow telling a risque story by the fire, a farmer dancing with a goose because no one else would. These were the small rebellions that warmed the spirit. Tonight, you may feel far from all that, far from candlelit choirs and rowdy villages and servants crowned in jest. But the feeling remains. The knowledge that laughter matters seven when it's fleeting. That joy, even false joy, can be real in the moment it's shared. So imagine the scene, a snow-covered village square, lanterns swaying in the wind, a group of muddy-footed children chasing each other in circles, a young woman, cheeks red from ale, twirling in a dress that doesn't belong to her, and at the center, a lord with a wooden spoon for a scepter, declaring that tonight no one is allowed to be sad. And for once, no one is. Let that image stay with you, not because it's perfect, but because it's enough. Now let's imagine what it felt like to walk out into the bitter medieval cold, not with a parka or scarf, but with what little fabric your household could spare. Because medieval clothing was many things practical, layered, handmade, but warm, not quite enough. Start with the base, a simple linen shirt or chemise, worn by almost everyone. It was light, it dried quickly, and it itched if not washed. But linen alone couldn't stop the cold. Over that, peasants layered woolen tunic, maybe a cloak, sometimes just scraps sewn together again and again until the seams gave out. Wool was the fabric of winter. It was scratchy. It was heavy. It smelled faintly of the sheep it came from, but it was what they had. And even then, there was never quite enough of it. In noble households, clothing grew fancier. Dyed fabrics, decorative buttons, layers upon layers, furs-lined collars and cloaks, leather gloves, silk undergarments. These were the luxuries of the well-off. But even among the elite, warmth was never guaranteed. Stone castles held the cold like a sponge, and even the richest garments couldn't stop your fingers from going numb. For the poor, warmth was about compromise. A mother might give her cloak to her child. A shepherd might stuff straw into his boots. Gloves were rare. So were hats. People wrapped cloth around their heads, tucked their hands into their sleeves, wore multiple pairs of socks that never quite dried from the day before. Shoes were simple, leather, soft, soled, often patched. They weren't waterproof, they weren't insulated. Once they got wet, they always got wetted. Took days for them to dry. Your feet were cold from October through April, and you got used to it. Children wore smaller versions of adult clothes hand-me-downs, mostly. Often too short, often threadbare. You could spot the poorer families in town, by the way. The children's elbows peeked through holes, and their feet showed from beneath too short tunics. When winter deepened, people didn't change outfits, they added to them. Cloaks over tunics over linen, cloaks pinned tight with bone or wood, wool hoods with long tails that could wrap around the neck like scarves, anything to trap the body's meager warmth. And yet, no matter how many layers you wore, the wind found its way in. There are accounts of women walking home from the fields with skirts frozen stiff, of men whose sleeves iced over while chopping wood, of children whose tears turned to frost on their cheeks before they could be wiped away. And there was no such thing as indoor clothes. You wore the same thing to sleep, to cook, to clean, and to walk across frozen fields. You might remove a belt or loosen your laces, but that was all. Undressing for comfort simply wasn't an option. Laundry was another problem. In winter, clothes rarely got washed. There wasn't enough water. There wasn't enough firewood to heat it. And once something got wet, it took days to dry sometimes on your body. The smell was part of life. You didn't complain. Still, people had their tricks. Herbs were sewn into hems to add scent. Charcoal was rubbed into boots to keep moisture out. Oiled cloth repelled snow a little longer. Old cloaks were patched with bits of fur rabbit, badger, whatever could be trapped and skinned. There's something deeply human in all of this. The effort, the trying, the quiet ways people fought the cold with needle and thread. A mother teaching her daughter how to patch a sleeve. A grandmother wrapping a strip of wool around a baby's feet. A neighbor offering an extra scrap of cloth when someone's coat gave out. Because, even if the clothes didn't keep out the cold, the people did their best to keep each other warm. So tonight, as you tuck yourself under layers that were stitched by machines and warmed by wires, think of those who relied only on wool and will, on cloaks passed down through generations, on coats so patched they were more repair than original. They may have shivered through the night, but they never stopped stitching. We've spoken much of people, their hunger, their freezing nights, their stubborn courage, but they weren't alone in their suffering, because winter came for the animals too. The same cold wind that rattled shutters and burned bare skin slipped under barn doors and through the cracks in wooden stalls. And when the frost lay thick across the village fields, it also found the backs of every creature that lived and worked beside humankind. Cows, pigs, chickens, goats, each one vital to survival. Each one depended on, and in many ways more vulnerable than, their owners. Let's begin in the byre part of a peasant's home or outbuilding where the cow was kept. Cows were rarely just livestock. They were family providers. Their milk made cheese, their manure fertilized crops. Their eventual meat, if it came to that, was a solemn and significant gift. But cows do not love the cold, and in winter they suffered. Hay was their main food, but hay was scarce. If the summer had been dry, or the harvest poor, there was never quite enough to last the whole season, and cows eat a lot. Without fodder, they grew thin. Their ribs began to show, their milk slowed, and sometimes they simply lay down and never got up again. A sick cow wasn't just a tragedy. It was a loss of income, of food, of hope. Then there were the pigs. Pigs were hardy, clever, and easier to feed than cows. But even they grew miserable in the snow. Without proper bedding straw, dry and warm, they shivered in their pens. Their feet cracked on the frozen ground. Their water turned to ice in wooden troughs, and if they got sick, there were no vets to call. Pigs were often slaughtered before the coldest months. Better to preserve the meat than risk the animal dying and the food being wasted. It was a grim choice, made with flint in hand, prayers in the heart, and very little ceremony. Chickens fared no better. Their thin feathers were no match for the biting cold. In bad winters, they stopped laying entirely. Their combs turned black with frostbite. Their feet froze to their roosts. And still, they were expected to provide eggs, meat, hope. In truth, the chickens that survived winter were the lucky ones. Horses, those noble, muscular companions, suffered too, often in silence. Draft horses used to plough fields or haul carts were too valuable to lose, but they were rarely kept warm. Their coats thickened, their manes frosted, their breath clouding the air as they stood in dark, cramped stalls. They waited, stiff-legged, hungry, cold. If their hooves cracked from ice, or their legs stiffened with cold, they might be unusable for weeks, and that meant the fields remained unploughed come spring. Goats, sheep, dogs, cats all lived close to humans, and when the humans suffered, so did they. Sometimes, peasants brought their animals indoors, not just for warmth, but for safety. A goat curled at the foot of the bed, a hen sleeping in a basket by the hearth, a dog lying across the doorway, not to guard, but to steal heat from the crack beneath the door. But there wasn't always room. Some animals died in the fields, or froze in barns when the hay ran out. Some were eaten out of necessity, not cruelty. You can imagine the heartbreak. A child saying goodbye to the family pig. A farmer butchering the cow he'd raised from a calf. There were tears sometimes, but they did what had to be done, because in the medieval winter, sentiment was a luxury few could afford. And yet, affection found a way. There are stories of monks warming stray dogs by the kitchen fire, of peasants weaving crude blankets for goats, of children sharing their crust of bread with the barn cat. Even in hardship, kindness survived. You see, the bond between humans and animals wasn't just practical, it was emotional. These creatures didn't just work for the people they worked with them, they endured together. Tonight, you might hear your own pet's breath beside you, the slow, contented rhythm of a dog's sigh or the warmth of a cat curled near your feet. Let that comfort you. Let it remind you that the story of winter isn't just about human survival. It's about every living thing that stood against the cold. Together, in every village, there were those who moved more slowly, who worked with trembling hands, who sat longer by the fire, the elderly, the widowed, the ill, the orphaned. And in winter, they suffered most of all. Medieval life was harsh even in good weather, but when the frost came, it tested the weakest among them in cruel and quiet ways. A younger man could chop wood, haul water, walk miles to barter for grain. But a widow with no sons? An aging grandfather with a bad knee? A child with no parents? They often had only one defense against the cold, the kindness of others. There were no pensions, no social workers, no food banks. Survival depended on your family if you had one, or on your neighbors if you were lucky. In tight-knit communities, people knew who needed help, and sometimes they gave it. Sometimes. Let's picture a woman named Agnes. She's 60 ancient by medieval standards. Her back is stooped, her joints stiff. Her husband died last spring. Her sons live far away. Her cottage is small, poorly thatched, and leans slightly in the wind. As winter deepens, Agnes burns the last of her firewood. She tries to ration her food. Her hands tremble when she tries to mend her cloak. The mornings are the worst her fingers barely move, and it takes her hours to warm enough to stand. On some days, she doesn't bother trying. Now picture her neighbor Edith. Edith is younger. She has 3 children. Her life is not easy either. But every few days, she sends her eldest to check on Agnes, to bring firewood, to share a small bowl of pottage. It isn't much, but it's something, and sometimes something is enough. These quiet gestures, the knock on the door, the spoonful of stew, the mended hem made the difference between life and death. Churches also played a role. Some monasteries kept lists of those most vulnerable. They sent out brothers with carts of bread and flasks of broth. In larger towns, poorhouses or almshouses gave shelter to the abandoned, but space was limited, and there was never enough to go around. In many cases, survival was a rotation of small mercies, a neighbor bringing in a stray sheep, a child delivering a bucket of water, a village elder giving advice from a seat by the hearth. Even young boys had roles to play. In some regions, they were sent house to house, checking on the old and sick. They carried bundles of sticks, shared news, told stories. They were messengers of warmth in more ways than one. It wasn't all kindness, of course. Some were forgotten. Some froze in their beds. Some wandered out, confused or starving, and never returned. And some who offered help, resented it, couldn't afford to give it again. But more often than not, people found ways to care, because everyone, deep down, feared becoming the weakest. And no one wanted to imagine facing the cold alone. You see, compassion in winter was not sentimental. It was practical. It was a shared investment in survival. Help your neighbor today, and they might help you tomorrow. It's hard to romanticize this kind of charity. It was not always cheerful or generous. Sometimes it was grudging, sometimes it was tired, but it existed, and that mattered. Because in a world without central heat, the warmest thing you could offer was yourself. So tonight, let's remember Agnes and Edith and every child who was told, run next door and check on old Henry. Let's remember the quiet ways people watched over one another, not because they had much to give, but because they understood what it meant to need. In the medieval winter, strength wasn't just found in muscle or firewood. Sometimes, it was found in a knock on the door. When the sun set early and the nights stretched long, there was little to do but wait. Wait for spring. Wait for warmth. Wait for the fire to burn brighter and the stores to last longer. But while their hands were idle, medieval people kept their minds moving. And they did it with stories. You see, storytelling was not just entertainment. It was survival. A kind of warmth that didn't come from the hearth, but from the imagination. Picture a cottage, know its walls damp with cold, its fire low, its corners dark. A family huddles together. Some mend clothes, others sip from a wooden bowl. One person, maybe the oldest, maybe the youngest, clears their throat and begins a tale of knights and dragons, of saints and miracles, of foxes that tricked wolves, and wolves that turned into men, of a woman who turned into a bird, of a child who slept through 100 winters and woke in the spring. The listeners lean closer, their eyes catch the firelight, their hands pause mid-stitch. For a few minutes the cold fades. They are somewhere else, someone else. Storytelling didn't require books. Most peasants couldn't read. But memory was strong, and the voice was powerful. Tales were passed from grandmother to grandson, from travelling bard to village girl, from one winter to the next. And everyone told them a little differently. In some homes, stories were shared every night, like prayer. In others, only when the mood allowed. Sometimes they were short just, a clever riddle or fable. Other times, they stretched for hours, spanning generations of imaginary heroes. And these weren't just tales for children. Adults clung to stories too. They needed them to remember brighter seasons, to imagine justice, to poke fun at the powerful, to believe that good could win, even when life offered no proof. There were stories of brave knights who rode into frozen forests and came out with magical cures, of lost sons who returned home wrapped in furs, of beasts who froze to stone, then thawed when kissed by sunlight. Some stories were warnings of spirits who roamed in the cold, punishing those who didn't share their bread, of witches who cursed those who mocked the old, of icy lakes that swallowed greedy travelers whole. Others were soft, dreamy things, of spring goddesses sleeping beneath the earth, of flowers whispering under snowdrifts, of love found in the last place you'd expect beside a barn, behind a hedgerow during the Feast of Candlemas. And of course, there were dreams. Not just the dreams of sleep, but the ones people whispered to each other after stories were told. Next year, I'll plant a second row of beans. When the weather breaks, we'll travel to the next village. Maybe the merchant will return with oranges from the south. Hopes, really, wrapped in ifs and maybes. They imagined warmer beds, softer bread, brighter colours, less ache in the knees, fewer holes in their shoes. They imagined the ice breaking, the birds returning, a letter from a son, a newborn that lived. It was all a kind of quiet resistance against the cold, against despair, against silence, because winter wanted them to feel stuck, trapped, numb. But stories cracked open the walls and let something in, something wild, something warm. And when the story ended, and the fire had burned low, and it was time for sleep, those stories didn't vanish. They followed people into their dreams. A child fell asleep, pretending to be the fox. A mother smiled, remembering a tale her own mother once told. A grandfather stirred, imagining himself walking again through the spring woods of his youth. So tonight, as you lie quiet, listening to your own breath, know this: you are part of a very old tradition, one where people shared stories to keep each other warm, to make it through the night, to pass the time until light returned. They told them in whispers, in laughter, in song. And now, in the hush between dusk and dawn, we tell them still. There is a certain kind of waiting that only winter can teach. It's not the eager kind, like waiting for a guest at the door, or for bread to rise on the hearth. No, this is slower, heavier, the kind of waiting that stretches on without telling you when it will end. In the Middle Ages, that waiting began sometime in January after the feasts had passed, after the last turnip was boiled, after the snow had crusted over the fields once more. And then, nothing. No planting, no gathering, no trading, unless you were brave or desperate enough to travel frozen roads. The animals didn't breed, the trees didn't grow, even the wind seemed to repeat itself. All eyes turned to the ground, waiting for it to change. Because it was there, in the frozen soil, that hope lay buried. Peasants knew the land intimately. They could tell you when a frost was light or deep. They watched the sky and sniffed the air. They read the thaw like a book, how soft the mud was, how quickly the snowmelt disappeared, whether the worms had begun to stir again beneath the surface. And so they waited. Plough Monday marked the symbolic beginning of the planting season. It came after Epiphany, on the first Monday of the new year. Villagers would gather, dress up, parade through the fields with decorated ploughseven if the ground was still too hard to break. The act wasn't practical. It was hopeful, a ceremony, a promise that the earth would yield again. Children followed behind with rattles and songs. Men pulled the plough themselves in jest. Women banged pots. Coins were collected. Ale was shared. Laughter rang out, though the fields remained untouched. The ground may not have been ready yet, but the people were. Still, most of the work remained weeks away. The real thaw came slowly. First the snow turned to slush, then the topsoil softened. Then, finally, the deeper frost released its grip. In that time between the first melt and the first seed, there was both urgency and restraint. Urgency, because hunger was deep and patience thin. Restraint, because planting too early could mean disaster if the frost returned. You can imagine the tension. A man gripping his spade, looking out at a patch of bare earth, unsure whether to trust it. A woman testing the soil with her fingers, deciding whether to risk her last handful of seed. And then, one day, it began. The first furrow turned, the first seed dropped. The first smell of damp soil reached the nose, not decay, not rot, but life. The work was hard, backs bent, hands bled, but the rhythm was welcome. It meant movement, purpose, and with every swing of the hoe, winter faded a little more. Even the animals responded. Cows began to give more milk. Chickens laid again. Lambs bleated in the distance. The entire village breathed in a little deeper, a little easier. But no one forgot what had come before. The waiting, the hunger, the long nights, the loss. And so, spring was never taken for granted. Each green shoot was a kind of miracle. Each warm wind a gift. Villagers planted in lines, in circles, in hopeful clusters. They shared seed when they could. They watched the skies. They sang. And they worked. Oh, how they worked. Because the only thing harder than waiting for the thaw was wasting it. Tonight, wherever you are, you may have your own kind of winter, your own frozen ground, your own quiet waiting. And just like them, you may not know when it will end. But the thaw comes. It always does. In their world and in ours. And when it does, when that first green blade pushes through the soil, when the ice melts into running water, when the earth no longer crunches underfoot you, remember what it took to reach that moment. And you begin again. So far, we've wandered through cottages and frozen fields, through hunger and hope, through stories whispered beside the fire. But now let's step into history, into the great, wide world beyond the village, and see what happened when winter struck not just the poor, but the powerful. Because in the Middle Ages, snow did not discriminate. Kings froze like peasants, armies starved, castles collapsed. Even history itself was shaped, sometimes, by a sudden frost. One of the most infamous winters arrived in 1316, the second year of the Great Famine. Torrential rain had drowned the crops the year before, and the cold that followed only deepened the crisis. People boiled leather, dug up old graves, stole from church stores. Parents abandoned children, nobles reduced their portions. And in France, chroniclers recorded that entire villages vanished emptied, not by war, but by snow and silence. Elsewhere, in 1120, a royal tragedy played out in winter's shadow. The White Ship, carrying the heir to the English throne William Adelin, son of King Henry I, was sailing across the English Channel. The sea was cold and black, the night was clear, but the ship struck a rock, and within minutes, it began to sink. The freezing water claimed almost everyone on board. William made it to a lifeboat, but when he heard his half-sister's cries, he ordered the boat to turn back. So many others climbed aboard that it capsized. He drowned. England was thrown into crisis. The succession fell apart. A bitter civil war known as the Anarchy followed. And it all began with a shipwreck on a frigid winter night. Closer to home, entire towns burned in winter. Fire was always a threat, but especially so when winds were high and water was frozen. In 1132, a fire swept across London Bridge during a bitterly cold night. Flames leapt from rooftop to rooftop, carried by the wind. Wooden homes burned like matchsticks. St. Paul's Cathedral and much of the city were reduced to cinders, and no one could stop it. Buckets of water froze before reaching the flames. People fled with only the clothes on their backs and barefoot in the snow, some carrying children, some weeping over lost books, tools, or kin. In armies, winter was often deadlier than the enemy. Soldiers marched through snow in thin boots and damp wool. Supply wagons got stuck in ice or mud. Horses died. Food spoiled. And once camp was made, the real battle began. Not against swords, but against frostbite, dysentery, and despair. During one campaign in Eastern Europe, a noble army froze so thoroughly that wolves feasted on their bodies before the enemy ever arrived. Even in castles grand, fortified, built to withstand sieges, the cold found a way in. Stone walls held no warmth. Fires blazed in the halls, but not in the stairwells or bedrooms. Water jugs froze. Ink turned solid. Servants wore gloves to carry dishes. And if a castle was snowed in during a siege, well, starvation came faster than arrows. In one winter siege, defenders were forced to eat rats and old leather. Horses were slaughtered. Dogs disappeared. Eventually, they surrendered not to the enemy's blade, but to their own empty bellies. History tends to remember crowns and coronations, but tucked between the lines are the snowstorms, the failed harvests, the frozen rivers that shaped what came next. And still, the world kept turning. New kings were crowned, new villages were built, spring returned, it always did. But those moments, those icy hinges, where the past nearly broke, remind us just how fragile everything was. A crown meant nothing in a snowstorm. A sword couldn't thaw frozen ground. A throne could be lost to a single night's frost. So tonight, as you lie safe and warm, remember that the great disasters of history weren't always battles or betrayals. Sometimes they were snowflakes, falling quietly, turning the world upside down. There are some things we don't want to imagine, but in the deep winters of the medieval world, they happened all the same. Because when the nights grew long and the food ran low, it was often the children who suffered first. They were smaller, softer. Their bodies burned through warmth too quickly. Their clothes were hand-me-downs, often too short or too thin. They were fed last at the table, if there was food at all. And in the harshest seasons, it showed hollow cheeks, quiet eyes, little fingers, purple with cold. Mothers noticed it first, the baby who stopped crying, the toddler who slept too long, the child who shivered through the night, then wouldn't wake in the morning. They tried everything, wrapping them in every scrap of cloth, pressing them close to their own bodies, feeding them the last of the milk, the last of the meat, the last of the strength in their arms. But sometimes, even that wasn't enough. Children didn't just die from starvation or frostbite. They died from what came next. Fevers, coughs, infections, and the slow, silent fading that came when a little body simply couldn't go on. In records from the time, you don't see much written about this. Medieval scribes didn't always record the death of a child unless they were noble. But in the margins, in the letters, in the notes of monks and midwives, you catch glimpses. She lost her third this winter. The boy did not rise from his sleep. Only the girl survived. In some winters, entire classrooms emptied, graveyards filled, and mothers named their next child the same name as the one they had lost, because grief didn't stop the world from moving forward. It's not that people didn't care. They did, fiercely. But death was a part of life, a common visitor, and the colder the winter, the more often he knocked. Still, the love remained. You see it in the way blankets were patched again and again for a child who had outgrown them. In the way toys were carved from scrap wood, even when hands were stiff with cold. In the way lullabies were sung not because the baby was crying, but because the mother was afraid to stop. Children brought light to dark homes. Their laughter, even if brief, was enough to lift tired hearts. Their questions, their wild little games, the footprints they left in the snow outside the cottage door. And when they were gone, the silence was deafening. Some families buried their children in wool, the only softness they could afford. Others wrapped them in cloaks that would have gone to younger siblings. A candle might burn in the church. A priest might murmur a prayer. But the real mourning happened quietly, at night, when no one was watching. And yet, somehow, families continued. Mothers held the next baby. Fathers mended the same boots for smaller feet. Life returned, slowly, hesitantly, like the snow melting on the edge of a roof. And the children who remained thin, strong, watchful, they carried those winters in their bones. They remembered. They helped others. They became the ones who knocked on the neighbor's door, who made room by the fire, who told stories so no one would forget. Because children were the most fragile part of winter, but they were also the reason people endured it. So tonight, if you know warmth, if you know safety, think of the little ones who once faced a world where winter could steal a breath without warning. Think of their mothers, their small wool caps, the toys left untouched beside the hearth. And if your heart feels heavy with that memory, let it be. Some things are worth feeling, even the things we wish had never happened. And now, we come to the part they waited for, the part that made all the rest bearable. Spring. It never came fast, never all at once. There was no sudden, joyful announcement, just a slow shifting, a gentler breeze, a patch of mud where there had only been ice. A bird song, faint but unmistakable, heard one morning above the crackle of the fire. It began quietly, but the heart felt it before the body did. For medieval people, spring was more than a season, it was a deliverance. Not just from cold, but from fear, from scarcity, from the deep silence of winter nights where every cough was a worry and every empty bowl was a question without an answer. Spring meant survival. The moment the ground thawed, tools were lifted. Hands that had been idle too long grew calloused again. The frozen earth was broken open not, gently but gratefully. Seeds were planted. Rows were measured with care, hopes buried in soil that might still be wet with snowmelt. Children ran barefoot again. Animals were let into pastures. Chickens returned to laying. The air smelled of damp wood and crushed grass. The village began to hum, and so did the people, faces that had been pale and still now flushed with movement, backs straightened, eyes brightened. Clothes were aired out in the sun, scarves were loosened, doors were left open just a crack. The rhythm of life quickened, but spring didn't erase what came before. It carried it like rings in the trunk of a tree, like calluses on the palm, like names on a stone. The memories of those lost lingered in the warmth. A baby not there to toddle in the yard, a grandfather's stool left empty by the fire, a neighbour's cottage, its door still closed. But even so, the world pressed forward. With every passing day, the colour returned. Greens broke through the grey. Flowers opened shyly. Bees returned to sleepy hives. The sun stayed longer in the sky. The church bells rang louder. Some feasted not lavishly, but enough. Eggs, fresh for the first time in weeks. Herbs, snipped from the edges of fields. The first soft greens added to pottage. A sweetness to the air that no spice could match. And laughter returned. First quietly, then with abandon. The kind of laughter that only comes from relief. There were festivals, May Day, Beltane, Whit Sundays of dancing, music, bonfires, days that lifted the spirit as surely as the sun lifted the fog. People gathered flowers, painted eggs, tied ribbons to trees. They sang songs older than memory, not to forget the winter, but to honour the fact that they had lived through it. And in the evenings, when the stars appeared later and later, people sat outside, not to escape the smoke, but to feel the breeze, to breathe without seeing their breath, to listen, not for wolves or the creak of the roof, but for frogs in the stream, for rustling wheat, for birds nesting under the eaves. And always, always, there was the work. Because spring did not mean rest. It meant the beginning of a new labour, but it was the kind of labour done with light in the heart, with the memory of winter still close enough to sharpen every joy. They had made it. Not all of them, but enough. And the ones who did carried the memory of those who didn't planted seeds with their names in mind, baked bread, and remembered the hands that once needed it, Saturday by the fire, and knew who was missing, but also who remained, and in that balance of mourning and renewal life found its rhythm again. So tonight, as this story draws to a close, and your eyes begin to grow heavy, take comfort in this truth. Winter always ended. Even in the darkest centuries, even in the cruelest years, spring returned. They believed it would, and they were right.